Hey there again. Hopefully, you had a good little pause there, grabbed a snack, a drink, and are ready to revisit the content that we have here to present in mini lecture number 2 in Unit 5, where we're talking about the renal and digestive systems. And here we're going to dive into Chapter 7, which focuses on the digestive tract. So when we look at digestive system structures, and to preview here, we're going to hit on monogastric and ruminant digestive systems. That'll make this section just a freckle longer, but I hope to get through it quick enough to try and keep it within that about the 10 to 12 minute time frame. So the mouth or oral cavity again starts the digestive tract, whether we have talking about lips, teeth, the tongue, the hard palate, the salivary glands. All of those start the digestive process or have some role in it. The food then passes through the pharynx, down the esophageal tube, where it enters the stomach, or when we talk about the ruminant, the reticular rumen area. Peristalsis is what we call the muscle contraction rhythmic kind of response that helps move that food along the pathways, all from getting it down the mouth all the way through the stomach, down the small intestine, large intestine, and then, of course, excreted through the rectum whenever we have waste product. Here again, we got the diagram, a cutaway of a dog, and start to look at the digestive tract structures there. So, of course, we talk about the food as it's ingested. It's swallowed, that bolus, then we call that a bolus. Once it's chewed, passes through the esophagus into the stomach, and stomach begins to contract and secrete these gastric juices. On the upper end of the stomach, you find mucins and salts that are excreted to help kind of balance out the stomach environment. And then the lower part of the stomach tend to have a lot of acids, very, very low pH acids that help break down some of those structures within the food substance that has been introduced. The contractions then kind of help with the mechanical digestion of food product. So the interior of the stomach, like I said, is a pretty harsh environment. It's generally, on balance, a very low pH with a lot of protein digesting enzymes, very little absorption in the stomach. You'll see a little bit of water absorption, but not much in terms of actual nutrient absorption. And the remaining partially digested food, what we call the chyme, leaves the stomach through the pyloric sphincter and enters the duodenum, the upper part of the small intestine. So you have some diagrams here at the top. Food bolus coming down the esophagus to be introduced into the stomach. That sphincter muscle then closes there, and you'll have a period for digestion before it maybe enters the small intestine at some period of time later in the monogastric. This slide shows you the various number of digestive juices that are introduced in the digestive tract and kind of their location of action and actually what they do. These are super, super important to understand in the nutritional process. Obviously, nutrition has a huge influence on health status, productivity status, and so forth of our animals that we're going to be talking about later on in the semester. So it's important to understand this particular slide. So if we speak particularly about monogastrics for a second, the duodenum is really essential to further digestion. You'll see a little bit of more acids introduced there, as you saw in the previous slide. And you'll see some hormones that start to get dumped in. Secretin, gastroinhibitory peptides, a bunch of things that get dumped in here, generally speaking, from the pancreas to help in breaking down that food product, to get it down into amino acids, simple sugars, break apart elements and things of that nature for absorption. Food then delivered to the small intestine, generally in the form of pretty short peptide chains. Those proteins are going to be broken down into pretty short peptide chains and can only be absorbed as single amino acids. Sugars, electrolytes, water, generally all absorbed through mucosal cells. And then the liver processes much of that absorbed nutrient before it enters the circulatory system. Here's a good cutaway of a piece of the small intestinal tract. And I want to call your attention to these folds and all the villi that are these little finger-like projections That is meant to increase surface area. And then if you stack that all back together, you'll notice the network of blood and veins that are going to interact with those things in order to capture those nutrients that are going to then be circulated throughout the body. The main function of the large intestine then is to pull water and electrolytes back from the fecal material and separate that out. So defecation requires both voluntary and involuntary movement in the colon and the rectum in order to expel any of the waste product. A little bit on species variation before we get into ruminants. And teeth of herbivores are adapted to their diet. You'll have, when we start talking about ruminants, monogastrics have both upper and lower incisors and a full mouth of teeth. Ruminants do not have upper incisors, and their jaw is offset a little bit. So there's a lot more mechanical processing needed to allow for full digestion. Now, in between those two are horses that are monogastrics like dogs and cats, but actually function very much like a ruminant. So a really, really huge cecum that leads to the beginning of the colon, and that colon divides into 4 regions. And so that's why a horse can be fed very, very similar to a ruminant with a very high fiber, high forage diet, but they actually function just like a monogastric. And actually their stomach is not much larger than that of a pig. So when we think about those ruminants that we're going to talk about in a second, and then also the horse, we have these symbiotic relationships with organisms, protozoa, bacteria, helpful organisms in those areas of the cecum or the rumen that help us digest the feed stuff. And I've been referring to ruminants, and we're talking about cattle, sheep, goats, deer, things of that nature. So generally speaking, ruminants have a 4-compartment stomach. So these regions are the rumen, sometimes referred to as the first stomach, and this is not always agreed upon depending upon which sciences you're reading. The reticulum, that's up here at the right side of the diagram, the omasum, kind of the basketball-looking structure here in the center, and the abomasum that's down here at the bottom, which is the final part of the 4-compartment ruminant stomach. This is very analogous to the true stomach of a monogastric. Here's some pictures, and I've labeled them for you: the rumen, the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum, left to right as you go across your screen. And notice the different structures. These papillae are helpful in increasing surface area. These little honeycomb structures here are helpful in capturing any foreign material that might be in the feedstuffs. The omasum, very similar, acts just like a grinding mill to help get that feed stuff into much, much smaller particle size. And then you see the very glandular structure and much more smooth muscle tissue of the abomasum. All right, a few things for clinical practice here as we start to get towards the end of mini lecture 2 here, and we think about diarrhea. So feces pass through the intestinal tract way too quickly. We may have some kind of infection that has set in, and we have then frequent defecation, and generally small amounts, may include some blood or mucus, but generally speaking, we have some kind of infection in there. And back to that slide where you had the many folds in the villi that I pointed out of the small intestine, actually bacteria can get in there and almost seal that out. So then you have trouble absorbing water and nutrients. The animal will lose weight, will become dehydrated as they battle that diarrhea process. So it's important to keep them hydrated as well as try and provide supplemental nourishment. So when we talk about sudden onset vomiting and diarrhea, it's the dehydration that is really much more dangerous than the diarrhea to begin with. And it's awesome symptomatic treatment. We'll do certain things because of what we see. But oftentimes you have to look a little bit deeper to find what the cause of those actual problems is. Of course, when we talk about the digestive tract, if they can suffer from diarrhea, they can also suffer from constipation. Dogs can get that if they are fed too many bones. So you have to be cautious of that. They love them, and we kind of feel like we're giving them a treat, but sometimes they can suffer constipation, and that can be problematic because, especially when you get to horses, that colic is very similar to kind of a blend between an increase in gas in the intestinal tract and a slowing down or a slight constipation of the intestinal tract, where you'll have gas buildup. But either way, the peristalsis contractions will stop, and that may cause diarrhea, it may cause a lot of gas, may cause severe constipation when we talk about horses. But those are problematic, and that peristaltic contraction needs to continue in order to keep food product moving down the digestive tract. If you encounter something like that, keep your horse walking. Mineral oil, we'll talk about some of that later on when we hit colic more specifically. In addition, we have some reasons that gas may not be eructated from a cow. Here's a cow to the bottom right of your picture. She's bloated. We can have just kind of like suds in the bathtub build up in there, and as long as there's gas in that bubble, it cannot be expelled, and that animal will swell up on the right side with gas, and she has to belch that out somehow. No, otherwise, she will have the risk of asphyxiation and death. So, as we wrap up this section, the renal system, as we talked about that in mini lecture 1, responsible for really eliminating waste product from the body. Evaluating urine really can help you start to get some preliminary indicators of health status, dehydration, failure, stones, pH, whatever it might be. And then make sure in section 2 that you can identify the differences in monogastrics and ruminants and contrast their digestive processes. Understand the impact that the feeding system has on those types of things, and then what challenges to look for that may be impacted by the type of feed or your feed performance that may be going on with the digestive tract. Thanks for listening to this section.